Okay, so you know how sometimes you just really want to get to the bottom of something? Like you need that deep understanding without having to wade through a ton of information?
Absolutely.
That's exactly what we're doing here today. This is like your express lane to being in the know. And the topic that's grabbed our attention today is patient care at hospitals in Shreveport, Louisiana. There's been some concern there, and we've gathered a bunch of different sources to try to make sense of it all.
Yeah, it looks like a really diverse collection of information you've pulled together here. We've got the official reports from hospitalinspections.org. Those give us the findings from inspections done at Physicians Behavioral Hospital and Brentwood Hospital.
Right, those are sort of like the official word.
Exactly. And then we have a whole other layer, which is what people are saying online and what their experiences have been. We've got a YouTube video that claims abuse complaints are being deleted. Then there are a bunch of Google Maps reviews for Oxnard LSU Health Shreveport Academic Medical Center and a change.org petition that brings up some really big issues, plus another YouTube video that actually shows someone trying to file a police report about their concerns.
Wow, so we've got formal reports and personal experiences.
Right, and to round it out, we also have a blog post and some additional text that just add to the overall worry.
So it sounds like we've got a lot to unpack here. And the mission for this deep dive is to look at all of it, the official stuff, the individual stories, the discussions that are happening publicly, and see if we can pull out the most important things about patient rights and what kind of care people are actually receiving at these places.
That sounds like a solid plan.
Awesome. So let's start by digging into those inspection reports from hospitalinspections.org. Let's focus on Physicians Behavioral Hospital first. One of the things that really jumped out at me was a concern around patient privacy.
Yeah, that was a key finding from the inspectors. They referenced it as tag no, A0143 in their report. And they came to this conclusion after reviewing patient records and talking to staff. It affected 1 out of the 5 records they looked at.
And what's interesting is that the hospital's own patient handbook has this clear statement about confidentiality. It basically says that staff can't even confirm if someone is a patient without their permission, let alone share any details about their treatment or condition.
It's meant to protect the patient's right to privacy.
Exactly. And this finding focuses on a specific patient we'll call patient #5, their form for authorizing who could receive information about them. You know, things like whether they were even in the hospital, how their treatment was going, their general condition. It was blank.
Blank.
Completely blank. It was marked unable to sign, witnessed by an RN.
So they couldn't give consent themselves.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Patient #5 actually had a medical power of attorney in place. It was received on May 16th, 2023.
So someone was legally designated to make decisions for them?
Exactly. And this document named their sister as the primary agent and their boyfriend as the secondary, meaning these were the people authorized to get information if the patient couldn't consent for themselves.
Makes sense.
But then a few days later, on May 19th, there's this case management note. It says the patient's pastor called the day before wanting to know how the patient was doing. And an S3 therapist, we don't know exactly what their role is, but that S3 probably refers to their department level. They actually shared a lot of very specific details with the pastor.
What kind of details?
Things like the patient urinating on herself, refusing medication, sleeping under her mattress. You know, really personal and sensitive stuff.
Wow. So despite a clear policy and a power of attorney being in place, someone who wasn't authorized got pretty detailed information.
Right. And during an interview on June 14th, an S2 LCSW, so that's an S2 licensed clinical social worker, they confirmed that the S3 therapist shouldn't have shared those details with the pastor. So this raises some red flags about whether staff are properly trained on patient confidentiality.
Definitely, it makes you wonder if this is an isolated incident or if it points to a bigger problem with how they handle sensitive information.
Absolutely. And it also makes you think, you know, what can patients do to make sure their information stays private if even a power of attorney isn't always enough?
Yeah, that's a really important question, especially in a setting like a behavioral health hospital where privacy is so crucial.
Right. Moving on, the second finding at Physicians Behavioral Hospital is also pretty concerning. This one has to do with their failure to report an allegation of abuse or harassment.
And that's also tagged as A0145 in the inspection report. The inspectors found that the hospital didn't report an initial allegation of patient abuse or neglect to the Louisiana Department of Health within 24 hours of becoming aware of it. And this was flagged in one of the 5 patient records they specifically looked at for self-reports to the LDH Health Standards section.
So this involves a patient we'll call patient #4. The nurse's notes from June 10th, 2023 mention a possible sexual encounter that happened after patient #4 went into a male peer's room.
Okay, and did they report that?
Well, the physician was told about it, but they decided not to report it to the LDH because they didn't think the patient was competent enough to consent to sex. Now, the police were called, and they did talk to the physician and LPN, and the ADON, that's the assistant director of nursing, but they didn't talk to either of the patients involved.
So the hospital decided not to report potential abuse based on their own assessment of the patient's competency. And the police weren't able to gather information directly from those involved. That raises some serious questions about due process and whether the patient's rights were fully considered.
Exactly, and here's another layer to this. The hospital's own self-reporting logs didn't even include patient #4. And the S1 administrator, so likely a high-level administrator, confirmed on June 14th that they hadn't sent the self-report to the LDH within that 24-hour window.
Which is required by Louisiana law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So not only did they not report it, they didn't even follow their own internal procedures for tracking these kinds of incidents.
Interesting.
And it just begs the question, if this is how they're handling potential abuse allegations, how can patients feel safe and trust that their concerns will be taken seriously?
That's a huge concern. It really undermines the whole idea of patient safety and protection.
Right, it does. Okay, so let's shift gears now and look at the findings for Brentwood Hospital. Again, these are from hospitalinspections.org, and it looks like they also had some problems identified during their inspection. The first one that stood out to me was about their grievance process for outpatients. Apparently, it wasn't really working as it should.
Yeah, the inspectors flagged this as tag no, A0119. They found that Brentwood Hospital wasn't ensuring that outpatients had a way to file grievances and have them addressed properly. And this was based on looking at records and talking to staff. Specifically, it involved a patient, we'll call patient #6, 1 out of 10 outpatients whose records were reviewed.
So Brentwood does have a policy. It's called RI.012, which lays out what a patient grievance is.
Yeah.
And they define it pretty broadly. It includes any written or even verbal complaints about the care they received, things that weren't fixed during their stay or that they didn't feel comfortable bringing up while they were at the hospital.
That makes sense. You want to give patients multiple ways to raise concerns.
Right. And patient #6's experience on June 21st, 2023 really highlights the issue here. He had just undergone electroconvulsive therapy, that's ECT, a procedure used for certain mental health conditions. He was awake and oriented after the procedure, but then realized he'd soiled himself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, understandably, he was really upset. He started using strong language, became agitated, and even mentioned getting a lawyer involved because he thought it might be malpractice.
I can imagine that would be incredibly distressing, especially right after a procedure when you're supposed to be recovering.
Right, and what makes this even more concerning is that the consent form and educational materials for ECT didn't even list incontinence as a potential side effect. So he might not have been fully informed about that risk.
So he wasn't necessarily prepared for that to happen.
Right. So the S2RN, that's the electroconvulsive therapy nurse manager, she did try to follow up with patient #6 by phone, and she referred him to the patient advocate.
Okay, so at least there was an attempt to address his concerns?
Yeah, but here's where the system really seems to break down. The S3 patient advocate said she doesn't actually deal with grievance investigations for outpatients. And to top it off, the S1QA director, the Director of Quality Assurance, confirmed that they weren't doing grievance investigations or completing the grievance process for outpatients at all.
So they had a policy, but they weren't actually following it for a whole category of patients.
Exactly. And it just makes you wonder, if patients don't even have a reliable way to report problems, how can the hospital identify areas where they need to improve and make things better?
It definitely raises concerns about accountability and whether they're taking patient feedback seriously.
Brentwood Hospital was also cited for multiple failures to report allegations of abuse or harassment within that crucial 24-hour time frame. And it's the same tag number, A0145, that we saw with Physicians Behavioral Hospital.
So another instance of not meeting those mandatory reporting requirements.
Right, the inspectors found 2 specific instances of this. The first one involved 2 patients out of 4 records that they reviewed, specifically for self-reports of abuse or neglect.
Okay.
And again, Brentwood has a policy that explicitly says any sexual or physical abuse or neglect has to be reported to the Department of Health and Hospitals within 24 hours. The LDH self-report form also lays out the same requirements.
There's a very clear guideline.
Very clear. But on July 9th, 2023, patient #4 reported that another patient #5 had grabbed her breast. But when the inspectors looked into it, they couldn't find any evidence that this was ever reported to LDHHSS. And on August 21st, the S1QA director confirmed that this should have been reported, but it wasn't.
So a clear violation of their own policy and the state regulation.
Absolutely. The second instance involved 1 out of 8 patient records reviewed for self-reports. And this one's especially troubling.
What happened?
A psychiatrist note from February 6, 2024, said that a patient, we'll call her patient #6, reported having back pain and abdominal cramping because she had been hit in the stomach by another patient the night before.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and a nurse practitioner's note from that same day confirmed that patient #6 had been hit and that she was 18 weeks pregnant. They ordered an ultrasound.
So a pregnant patient was physically assaulted. That's really serious.
It is. But even with this serious incident, the S1 director of QA said on February 19th that they didn't even know about it. There was no incident report and no investigation. They also confirmed that a self-report should have been filed with the LDH, but it wasn't.
So, again, a failure to report and a lack of internal follow-up.
Right. And even the S2 chief nursing officer, the CNO, was unaware of the incident. They did confirm the pregnancy, though. So you have a pregnant patient being assaulted, and key people in the hospital are completely in the dark about it for weeks.
That's a major breakdown in communication and in following those mandatory reporting procedures, especially when you have a patient who's extra vulnerable because of her pregnancy.
Exactly. Another finding for Brentwood Hospital this time, it's tag no A0123, and it has to do with not giving proper written notice about grievance decisions. And so what's the point of having a system for patients to raise concerns if you're not going to close the loop and let them know what happened?
Yeah, it defeats the whole purpose.
The inspectors looked at 12 patient records and found that in one case, the hospital didn't provide a written notice about the resolution of a grievance. This is for a patient's representative we'll call patient #1.
Okay.
And Brentwood's own policy, RI.012, remember, that policy is very specific about what needs to be included in this written notice. You're supposed to tell them who to contact for follow-up, what steps were taken during the investigation, what the findings were when the grievance was considered closed, and even if there were any temporary responses while they were still figuring things out.
So it's about transparency and keeping the patient informed.
Exactly. So in this case, patient #1's father was acting as their representative, and he was really unhappy when they were discharged on February 5th, 2024. He even asked for reports of any previous incidents involving his child.
So he was actively trying to get more information.
Yeah, patient #1 had actually filed 2 grievances in February, and the letter they got on February 7th mentioned that they had done an investigation, but they didn't say what the results were.
Which is against their own policy.
Right. And on February 21st, the S3 Director of Patient Advocacy confirmed that those investigation results were missing from the written response. It's like they went through the motions of investigating, but they didn't actually share the outcome with the person who raised the concern in the first place.
That's so frustrating for the patient and their family. It makes you feel like your concerns aren't being taken seriously.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder if they're actually using these grievances to learn and improve their processes.
Right, because the whole point is to identify areas where they can do better.
Okay, last finding for Brentwood Hospital. This one's tagged as A0396, and it's about not keeping nursing care plans updated. This seems like such a basic part of providing good care, making sure everyone's on the same page about what a patient needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
The inspectors looked at 12 patient records and found that 5 of them, patients #2, 7, 9, 11, and 12, their care plans weren't updated consistently after they had physical altercations with other patients and incident reports were filed.
So their care plans weren't reflecting what was actually happening.
Right. Now, Brentwood's policy, TX.018, says that care plans for acute patients have to be reviewed and revised every 7 days at least, and even more often if the patient's behavior changes significantly or if they need special interventions like seclusion or restraint.
Which makes sense because you need to adjust the plan based on how the patient is doing.
Exactly. And what's really concerning is that these care plans weren't updated even after documented fights. Like the S1 director of QA admitted that patient #7's care plan didn't say anything about aggressive or assaultive behavior, even though there were incident reports about it.
That's a huge red flag.
Right. And the S2 CNO also acknowledged that the care plans for patients #2, 9, 11, and 12 didn't mention these behaviors and that they should have been updated. If the care plan isn't accurate, how can staff provide the right kind of support and keep everyone safe?
It's like they're operating with outdated information, and that puts both the patient and the staff at risk.
Exactly. So those inspection reports really do raise some big concerns about both Physicians Behavioral Hospital and Brentwood Hospital. We're seeing issues with patient privacy, how they handle abuse allegations, the effectiveness of their grievance processes, even basic care planning. But like you said earlier, we also have this whole other layer of information coming from online sources.
Right, those firsthand accounts and public discussions.
Exactly. So let's dive into those. There's this YouTube video with a pretty attention-grabbing title. It's called Ochsner Health Deletes Patient Abuse Torture Complaints About LSU Hospital, Shreveport, Louisiana.
Wow, that's a heavy accusation.
Yeah, it definitely suggests that they're intentionally trying to silence people who are speaking out about abuse. And it sort of echoes this bigger theme that we've seen popping up about possible cover-ups and lack of accountability. Now, the video itself doesn't actually have any spoken words, just some background noise that sounds like it might be in another language. But the title alone is pretty alarming.
It definitely makes you want to dig deeper and see if there's any truth to that claim.
Okay, so then we have this pasted text that simply says, investigate the reviews on Google Maps, and it names Ochsner LSU Health Shreveport Academic Medical Center.
So we took that advice and went straight to the Google Maps reviews for that facility. And there's a pretty clear pattern in what people are saying. While there are some positive reviews sprinkled in, a lot of people are expressing concerns about inconsistent care, long wait times, and even rude or unprofessional staff. So a mix of positive and negative, but enough negative reviews to raise some eyebrows.
Exactly. And there are also complaints about billing problems and the overall quality of care.
Yeah.
For example, one reviewer talks about possibly being misdiagnosed after waiting in the ER for a long time. Another person describes waiting for 28 hours with their elderly mother who was in a lot of pain, and they felt like the staff didn't communicate with them at all.
28 hours? That's a really long time to wait, especially when you're in pain and worried.
Right. And several other reviewers talk about feeling ignored or disrespected by the staff. Plus, there are multiple mentions of billing errors and having a hard time getting those sorted out with the hospital.
So those complaints touch on several different aspects of the patient experience, from the medical care itself to the communication to the administrative side of things.
Right. And it's interesting that the owner of the Google Maps page often responds to these negative reviews. But they usually just say something generic like, please email us your feedback. It doesn't really address the specific concerns that people are raising publicly.
Yeah, that's a common tactic for managing online reviews. But as you said, it doesn't really demonstrate transparency or show that they're taking those concerns seriously and actually trying to fix them.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on, we also have a change.org petition titled Stop Patient Abuse and Cover Up at LSU Health Sciences Center, Shreveport. This petition was started by an organization called Louisiana Citizens for Healthcare Reform back in 2012. And it really echoes some of the serious allegations we've been seeing in other sources.
Oh, wow. So these concerns have been circulating for a while.
Yeah, it seems so. And the petition claims that even though LSU Health Sciences Center is funded by taxpayer dollars, there are tons of documented cases of patient abuse and medical negligence. And they allege that the local media is ignoring it and that LSU is actively covering it up.
So they're pointing to a systemic problem.
Right, they're not just talking about isolated incidents. They're saying this is a pattern of behavior. And the petition goes on to list a bunch of really disturbing examples. They talk about a robbery victim who died after allegedly having gauze stuffed in his mouth, a psychiatric patient with cigarette burns, a young girl who died in the ER because the trauma team was slow to respond, and even claims that an ER nurse and a surgeon were working under the influence.
Those are incredibly serious accusations.
They are. And they don't stop there. The petition also mentions a 6-year-old girl who bled to death because a surgeon delayed treatment, claims that hospital staff were illegally getting drug prescriptions, a patient who died after a 15-hour wait in the ER.
Wow.
And ongoing fraudulent billing practices. It's a really long list of really serious allegations.
It's overwhelming to hear all of that.
It is. And it really makes you question what kind of protections are in place for patients and what recourse they have if something like this happens to them.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, because if these allegations are true, it suggests a system that's failing to protect vulnerable people.
The petition also claims that patient satisfaction scores at LSU Health Sciences Center were way lower compared to another hospital in the area. And they say the administration was more focused on PR than actually improving patient care.
So focusing on appearances rather than addressing the underlying issues.
Right. They also allege that employees were sent intimidating notices to discourage them from speaking out. And ultimately, they're calling on the governor of Louisiana and the federal HHS secretary to intervene.
So they're demanding action from the highest levels of government.
Exactly. Okay, next up we have another YouTube video. And this one's really powerful because it includes a transcript of someone actually calling the police to report abuse at what they call LSU Hospital. And it's a pretty raw and frustrating experience for the person making the call.
Oh, wow. So we're hearing directly from someone who's trying to report what they've experienced or witnessed.
Right. And they have a lot of trouble just getting through to the Shreveport Police Department. They keep getting transferred or put on hold.
So already facing barriers right from the start.
Yeah. And when they do finally get to talk to someone, they explain that they want to report abuse and torture of disabled people at LSU Hospital by the hospital employees.
Abuse and torture, those are incredibly strong words.
They are, and the caller specifically mentioned strangulation happening while patients were in restraints and seclusion.
That's horrifying to imagine.
It is, and throughout the call, you can just hear this sense of frustration and powerlessness. They feel like they're being given the runaround.
By the police.
Yeah, they mentioned the Shreveport Police, the Catocara Sheriff's Office, and the State Police. And they keep asking if there's some kind of policy that prevents law enforcement from investigating crimes against disabled people in hospitals. Like they're wondering if there's some kind of loophole that makes it harder to protect this vulnerable population.
That's a really valid question, because everyone deserves equal protection under the law, regardless of their disability status.
Exactly. The caller also mentions trying to report abuse before and being met with indifference or even pushback from hospital staff. They specifically name someone they call LG Poly. And they also mention hospitalinspections.org, bringing up the very issues we discussed about the grievance processes.
So it's like their concerns were dismissed or ignored by the hospital, and now they're facing roadblocks trying to report it to the police.
Right. The caller also says they don't want to go to the police station in person because they've been badly beaten by Shreveport police in the past. So they're understandably scared and hesitant to go there. Eventually, the dispatcher offers to call them back after 10 p.m. to take the report over the phone.
So at least there's a willingness to try to accommodate their needs and make it easier for them to report.
Yeah, it's a small step, but at least it's something. And the caller continues to share more allegations. They say they've seen hospital staff mistreat other patients. They even name specific people, including a police officer who they claim would taunt patients.
That's awful.
And they mention a Captain Jamie Walker who allegedly said he'd only get involved if a lawyer contacted him directly. Again, it reinforces this feeling that it's incredibly hard for everyday people, especially those without resources, to get justice and hold the hospital accountable.
Yeah, it highlights the power dynamics at play and how challenging it can be to speak truth to power, especially when you're already dealing with a system that might not be on your side.
The caller also echoes the concern about abuse complaints being deleted from Google reviews. So it's like there's this fear that their voices are being silenced and that the truth is being hidden.
It paints a really bleak picture.
It does. Okay, last but not least, we have a blog post from Louisiana Citizens for Healthcare Reform. This one's from way back in 2011.
So even further back than that petition.
Right, and this blog post alleges that drug abuse among nurses and doctors at LSU HSC Shreveport was widespread. And they claim it was an open secret within the hospital.
So not just isolated cases, but a systemic problem.
Exactly. They say there was an ER nurse who kept testing positive for drugs, and that people knew about it all the way up to the administration.
But nothing was done about it.
Well, they claim that suggestions for random drug testing were ignored. And they give a bunch of examples of the alleged drug use: illegal and legal psychotropic drugs, alcohol use by nurses, DWIs and DUIs among staff. It's a long list.
So a really troubling picture of potential impairment among those responsible for patient care.
Right. And the blog post directly connects this alleged drug use to patient abuse. They cite documented cases of beatings, torture, criminal negligence, and incompetence. And they list some really awful examples: a patient with a broken jaw, the wrong size catheter being used, a patient dying after having their mouth stuffed with gauze, another patient dying after waiting 3 days in the ER, patients with cigarette burns, misuse of prescriptions, and fraudulent billing.
Wow, so they're connecting the dots between the alleged drug abuse and the alleged patient abuse.
Exactly. And they claimed that people who had documented histories of drug abuse and patient abuse were actually promoted within the hospital over more qualified candidates who didn't have those issues. They even mentioned EEOC judgments to back up their claim.
So they're alleging a pattern of not just ignoring, but actually rewarding harmful behavior.
Right. And Louisiana Citizens for Healthcare Reform recommends replacing certain political office holders and says they've even contacted the UN Human Rights Council to investigate.
Wow, going to the international level.
They also talk about helping abuse victims and their families, And they mention one case involving an assault by an LSU HSC police officer who they say had a criminal record.
So it's not just about the healthcare providers, but also the security personnel.
Right. And they end by calling for random drug testing for all hospital staff and saying that they'll keep exposing wrongdoing, even though they claim there's media suppression and intimidation of employees.
So they're really committed to shining a light on these issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, we have this pasted text that talks about a woman who was found dead in a secure area of LSU Ochsner's Hospital after being missing for 3 days. And this text links her death to the broader claims of patient torture by hospital security.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a really disturbing story. And the text goes on to make even broader allegations about what they call a criminally syndicated network operating in Shreveport.
Criminally syndicated network? That sounds like something out of a movie.
It does. They allege that 911 operators hang up on people reporting police violence, that residents are being overcharged for water, that the media is suppressing negative news, that there are predatory foster guardians, voting irregularities, and that minorities and poor people are being treated with extreme cruelty.
So they're painting a picture of widespread corruption and abuse of power.
Right. And it's important to note that these are very serious allegations, but they're coming from an anonymous source, and we don't have any evidence to corroborate them.
So it's crucial to be cautious and not jump to conclusions. But at the same time, it's important to take these claims seriously and consider the possibility that they might be true.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that we've encountered a lot of concerning information from a variety of sources. Official reports, online reviews, petitions, personal accounts, blog posts, and it all centers around patient rights and the quality of care at hospitals in Shreveport, Louisiana.
And despite the different perspectives and sources, some really consistent themes have emerged. You know, those allegations of privacy violations, the inadequate responses to abuse, the problems with grievance processes, the concerns about staff conduct and qualifications. And then there are those accusations of cover-ups and a lack of accountability.
Exactly. And it leaves us with some really important questions. What kind of accountability systems do we need in place to make sure these things don't happen? How can we ensure that oversight mechanisms are actually working to protect patients? And most importantly, how can we as a society protect the most vulnerable people who are relying on these institutions for care?
It's a call to action for all of us to pay attention to these issues and advocate for change.
Absolutely. Because everyone deserves to feel safe and receive quality care when they're in a hospital.
It's a fundamental human right.
It is. And it really highlights the importance of transparency and making sure that patients and their families have a voice. We need to listen to them, believe them, and take their concerns seriously.
Because they're the ones who are directly impacted by these systems, and they're often the first to notice when something's wrong.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, think about what you've learned today and consider what you can do to make a difference. Whether it's speaking up, supporting advocacy groups, or simply staying informed. Because change starts with awareness and action.
And every voice matters.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this has given you a better understanding of the complex issues at play, and we encourage you to continue learning and engaging in these important conversations.